Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Unbiased Truth with your host, Branson. And, on the subject of affordability, that's something that most Americans think of day in and day out as the costs continue to increase and stuff like that, and our global standing among the world shifting on a constant basis. You know, um, on the topic of affordability, which we saw was so crucial to Mamdani's victory, which I don't agree with his policies like at all for the most part. Something, but the reason that someone like him won, a communist, is because he was always talking about affordability the whole time and referencing it and mentioning it, while his rivals Cuomo and the others would just be pointing the finger at him and talking about how he's a communist. Well, that resonated with a lot of people. And, even though a lot of it was migrant-born, New Yorkers and stuff, they still resonated with that because the high cost of living in a dense population of a city like that, an urban area, especially Manhattan or New York City, is like so expensive to live in nowadays that most Americans can't seem to afford to live there at all. Because you have a lot of other foreign entities and corporations and people from around the world that are buying like real estate and the market share over there, which caused a lot of Americans to have to move out to the suburbs or to just like rent. And otherwise, because it's impossible to actually physically own property in a place such as New York. And we see that in a lot of other things. There's a lot of the main cities and urban areas around the country continue to get really expensive. I'm from San Diego, and San Diego in the last few years has like continued to skyrocket in the prices for homes. Even to just share a home or something, or like rent one out. It's extremely expensive. It was like a couple years ago, it was like $2,000 for like the smallest, shittiest studio apartment in San Diego, and it wasn't even in downtown San Diego. It was like in the suburbs of San Diego, in like another little town of El Cajon. It was like 2K, for a shitty ass studio, and that says something, and especially says something when we have a lot of people, especially like Ben Shapiro, that are just saying, "Oh yeah, well, it might be a possibility that you might not be able to live where you were and your whole family lived and died there for generations. You might have to move away because you can't afford to live there or something like that." It's like, what? How dare you say that? A lot of people clapped back and said they weren't happy with him just saying, you're just gonna have to be satisfied and happy, and accept it that everything's getting priced out. Most Americans are getting priced out, and like the rent continues to climb in most places around the country, in most cities and urban areas. And like, oh, you just gotta accept it. Like, no, that's why people voted for Trump. That's why people are unsatisfied with the current system, the way it's working, is because they're not happy with that. Stuff shouldn't just continue to climb without wages keeping up. So like eventually no one's gonna have money to do that. And it's funny that someone like Ben Shapiro says something like that, because I got a story for you all where there's Israeli, one of Israel's biggest companies is buying a lot of like rental properties all over the country, and like kicking tenants out and pricing them out pretty much and stuff like that, where people can't even afford to live there. And that's actually a crazy story because that's totally emblematic of how foreign nationalities and foreign corporations continue to buy, either like the Chinese with buying a lot of farmland around military bases around the country, or just a lot of like people from around the world buying areas in New York City downtown or like Los Angeles or something like that, and that prices out a lot of like normal hardworking Americans, you know but anyway, this company has been they've been behind a lot of mass evictions of people. They've been buying pretty much, they've been going and installing new gadgets and appliances in a lot of places that they buy. And then because of that, they'll raise the rent by by up $400, $500 or more. Like even more, there was like one, there was $800 in one place after a couple months when they renovated stuff. But yeah, they're just pricing stuff out, and they've been behind a lot of mass evictions and stuff like that, and they've pretty much just been taking over huge swaths of real estate across the country. And yeah, gadgets, raising the rent by nearly $400 a month, you know, because they're trying to do that. They're trying to buy up places and just like take it over. And there's been, there's a couple stories here from South Texas, Florida, in North Carolina, the Sun Belt area and stuff like that, which is supposed to be cheaper for people to live in. But they've been doing that. But the craziest part is that this foreign corporation has ties with Israel. That's not totally surprising. But they've been behind a lot of extensive settlements in like the West Bank and Palestine and stuff like that, and they have extensive ties with the Israeli military, the IDF, and they have they're definitely a huge part of the Israeli establishment. Netanyahu probably is like rubbing shoulders and best buds with a bunch of them. And so yeah, that's just crazy that they're now trying to influence stuff here. They're the 34th largest landlord in the country here, but this is also like representative with other stuff going on, such as BlackRock continuing to buy a bunch of properties throughout the country, and like absorbing a lot of smaller subsidiaries into their like organizations and stuff like that, where on the surface and the label might not say owned by BlackRock, but you start digging through a lot of things and connecting it, and BlackRock owns a bunch of like different like rental organizations and stuff like that. So that's crazy, and BlackRock is at least owned by Americans, I think, but this thing isn't. They're a huge partner and component of the Israeli establishment, and they're constructing settlements in Palestine, and kicking Palestinians out of their homes, and now kicking Americans out of their homes as well. What a great ally that Israel is, right? And yeah, so they've been doing that, but just emblematic of how foreign ownership of land in the country is weakening the American home buyer, and that's crazy that this is happening, and no one's been doing anything to stop it. I at least thought Trump would have like tried to buy back or kick out some of the Chinese from buying farmland around the military bases throughout the country, but they haven't been doing that, and I wrote a whole story on that as well. But this company has been pushing Americans. It's 9 times the rate of the average landlord, 9 times the rate that they've evicted Americans compared to other locations by other companies. So yeah, that just this company called Elko, that was the name of it. I didn't mention it earlier, but it's Elko. But yeah, how Israel has such a ties over there, and now they have ties over here and stuff like that. Deep ties to Israeli military, including the genocide in Gaza and everything like that. And it's just funny how no one knows what's really going on, but then you peek beneath the shadows, and then you find out that there's a bunch of stuff going on. That's where all the creepy crawly things are all doing their concerts and their little mayhem and stuff like that. But yeah, that's just crazy, because even though it's only the 34th largest landlord in the country, BlackRock is probably like the first or something, the second. It's still, that just shows the rot in the system, that there's a ton of problems and there's not much being done about it. And especially like even besides Israel, that this whole housing crisis and affordability crisis has been such a letdown, and nothing's really being done. I don't know if anything really will be done at this point. I really hope so, but when stuff gets this out of balance, it paves the way for stuff to happen, extreme events such as like the build up to the French Revolution, or the Soviet Revolution in Russia and stuff. People just get so unhappy because their life needs aren't being met, and housing is a huge part of that. And unfortunately, if nothing continues to be solved or something, this is just going to build up into something else, which we're starting to see with Nick Fuentes and the Groyper movement, that younger people, especially younger Gen Z males, are so unhappy, and they realize they just don't have a stake in the future when you have things like this. You have the average homeowner in the U.S. being like 68 or something like that, 68 years old, compared to like in 1982 or something, early 80s, when it was only like 28, like almost like my age, just a little older than me. And now there's no chance I'm going to be a homeowner within the next several years, unless I buy a property in like, say, in the middle of the country in the Midwest, like Kansas City, which, I live in right now. But You know, like any place in like the big cities, you know, the east or west coast or something like that, way too out of my price range. Won't even be able to live there, and that's a real bad thing, you know. But especially with Israel and their deep ties within here, you know, and we already know they have a ton of ties in the Epstein stuff, you know, that Epstein himself was a double agent for Mossad. So, but yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments, and yeah, catch you in the next one.